Breaking news tonight, tease. Tensions have erupted into violence between the Irish mob and the Italian Mafia on New York's waterfront. Breaking news tonight, tensions have erupted into violence between the Irish mob and the Italian Mafia on New York's waterfront.
Before Al Capone became a household name, before Chicago burned under gunfire and bootleg whiskey, before the word gangster became part of American mythology, there was a stretch of waterfront in Brooklyn where everything was decided, not in courtrooms, not in City Hall, but on damp wooden piers beneath swinging cargo cranes, surrounded by the smell of salt, coal, and blood. In the early 20th century, the Brooklyn docks were not just a place of work. They were the beating heart of New York's economy, and whoever controlled them controlled everything that flowed into America: food, fuel, liquor, jobs, power. And for a brief, violent moment in history, those docks became the battlefield for one of the most brutal gang wars New York had ever seen. On one side stood the Irish, hard-drinking, fiercely territorial, bound by loyalty and silence. On the other, the Italians, disciplined, organized, patient, and increasingly deadly. This was not just a fight between gangs. It was a fight between two immigrant worlds, both forged by famine, poverty, and exclusion, both desperate to survive in a city that had no room for weakness. Men would be stabbed in alleys and left to bleed into the cobblestones. Bodies would surface in the East River. Witnesses would see everything and say nothing. And hidden inside this war was the making of modern organized crime. Because this was where Al Capone learned to kill, where Frankie Yale built an empire, where Albert Anastasia first tasted power, and where the Irish White Hand Gang began its slow, violent collapse. This is the story of the Brooklyn docks, where America's underworld chose its future.
Welcome to EpochLens, where history breaks open and the past is finally seen.
To understand why the Brooklyn docks became a killing ground, you first have to understand what they meant to the city. In the early 1900s, New York was not just a city, it was the gateway to the world. And Brooklyn was its loading dock. Every single day, ships arrived from Europe, the Caribbean, and South America, heavy with cargo. Sugar from Cuba, coffee from Brazil, coal from Pennsylvania, whiskey from Canada, manufactured goods from across the Atlantic. Nothing entered the city without passing through the docks, and nothing left without permission. The men who unloaded those ships, the longshoremen, were the gatekeepers of that flow. They decided which crates moved first, which went missing, which trucks waited, which ships were delayed. Control the longshoremen, and you controlled the city's bloodstream. That was why the docks mattered more than any street corner or neighborhood turf. This wasn't about pride alone. This was about logistics, leverage, and money on an industrial scale. A single dock strike could cripple the city. A single delayed shipment could cost a company thousands. A single stolen crate could feed a gang for weeks. And in a city where immigrants were desperate for work, whoever decided who got hired wielded godlike power. That power, at first, belonged to the Irish. The Irish didn't come to America chasing crime. They came chasing survival. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland was hollowed out by famine. Entire villages vanished, families were erased, and those who survived fled across the Atlantic in ships so overcrowded and diseased they became known as coffin ships. When they reached New York, the promise of opportunity collapsed almost immediately. There was no land waiting, no welcome, no safety net. Irish immigrants were packed into slums, 5 Points, Hell's Kitchen, and eventually the waterfront districts of Brooklyn. They were poor, Catholic, foreign, and unwanted. Employers hung signs that said it plainly: no Irish need apply. Their children were beaten in schools for their accents. Their religion was mocked as un-American. Their loyalty was questioned, and so they did what excluded people throughout history have always done. They turned inward. They hired each other, protected each other, and when the law refused to protect them, they created their own. The docks offered something rare, work that didn't care about accents, education, or respectability, only muscle. Irish men flooded the waterfront, and slowly, quietly, they took control. Irish Town, a city within a city. At the heart of this new Irish stronghold was a neighborhood officially called Vinegar Hill. Unofficially, everyone knew it as Irish Town. It was a maze of narrow streets and crooked alleys wedged between warehouses and piers. Tenements leaned toward each other like tired men. Sunlight barely reached the ground. Families slept 10 to a room. Disease spread faster than gossip. Infant death was so common it barely registered, but it was theirs, and in a city that treated them as outsiders, that mattered. Irish Town developed its own rules, its own justice, its own hierarchy. Police entered cautiously. Outsiders rarely stayed long. And from this environment emerged a new kind of leader. Not politicians, not businessmen, enforcers, men who understood violence as language, men who could organize fear, men like Denny Meehan. Denny Meehan didn't grow up dreaming of power. He grew up dodging hunger. Born in 1889 in the heart of Irish Town, his life unraveled early. His mother died when he was 6. His father vanished. There was no safety net, no extended family waiting to catch him. The street raised him. By the time he was 10 years old, he was already familiar with institutions meant for hardened criminals, reformatories and workhouses designed not to rehabilitate but to break. They didn't break him, they sharpened him. Each stint made him harder, more confident, more convinced that the only real law was the one enforced by fear. By his early 20s, Meehan was already a known figure, a thief with instincts, a fighter with no hesitation, a leader who tolerated no challenge. He built his first crew on Warren Street, the Red Onion Gang. Their method was simple and effective. Walk into a shop, ask for red onions. When the shopkeeper turned his back, pull a gun, fast, quiet, ruthless. And anyone who crossed Meehan didn't just disappear, they were erased. By 1913, at just 24 years old, Denny Meehan had killed multiple men, including members of his own gang. Loyalty to him was absolute, or it was fatal. The docks took notice. Power moves toward the water. As Meehan's reputation grew, so did his ambition. Street robberies were small money. The docks were an empire. The waterfront wasn't protected by locks or fences. It was protected by silence, by unions, by hiring halls, by men who decided who worked and who starved. Meehan understood that if he could control labor, he could control everything else. So he did what he always did. He intimidated, he bribed, and when that failed, he killed. Slowly, pier by pier, the Irish tightened their grip, from Red Hook to the Erie Basin, from Pier 1 through Pier 9. Cargo moved only with permission, and anyone who tried to bypass that permission learned quickly what it cost. By the mid-1910s, the Brooklyn waterfront didn't just answer to Denny Meehan, it feared him, but fear on that scale couldn't be maintained by one man alone. It required enforcers, men whose reputations were enough to silence rooms. And Denny had 2 of the most dangerous, Wild Bill Lovett and Pegleg Lonigan. Wild Bill Lovett, the enforcer with no brakes. Wild Bill didn't look like what people expected. He was clean-cut, well-spoken, almost polite. That illusion was intentional, because behind it was a man who loved gunfire. Born into a strict Catholic household, Bill Lovett had been educated, disciplined, and given every chance to live a respectable life. But the docks had other plans. By his early 20s, he had already been arrested over a dozen times. He carried a pistol, like a habit, and a dock hook, sharpened for when guns weren't close enough. Unlike Meehan, Bill didn't enjoy theft. He enjoyed confrontation, gunfights in public places, shots fired where witnesses could see but never speak. He wanted his name whispered, and it was. The nickname Wild Bill wasn't a joke, it was a warning. When he drank, he became unpredictable. When he fought, he didn't stop. And when someone crossed the White Hand Gang, Bill was often the last thing they ever saw. Yet even Bill had rules. Violence, in his mind, had purpose. It was meant to enforce order. That belief would matter later. Peg Leg Lonigan, born for blood. Peg Leg Lonigan didn't need rules. He had rage. Born into a family where crime was tradition, Peg Leg's childhood was soaked in violence. His parents had ties to Manhattan gangs. His relatives were suspected killers. And before he was even a teenager, he had already killed. A street accident cost him his leg, replacing it with a wooden prosthetic. The injury didn't slow him down, it hardened him. He drank constantly, fought endlessly, and seemed to feel nothing. Where Bill was calculated, Peg Leg was chaos. He laughed during beatings, escalated fights for entertainment, and never backed down, even when it made no sense. To the men under them, the message was clear. Mihan was the brain. Bill was the fist. Peg Leg was the knife. Together, they made the White Hand Gang untouchable for a time. Why the Irish held, and why it wouldn't last. The Irish controlled the docks through fear and familiarity. They knew the streets, they knew the unions, they knew the police, and how much they cost. Hiring halls became choke points. Only loyal men worked. Anyone else waited or paid. Every crate was taxed, every shipment skimmed, every business along the waterfront paid tribute. It worked because the Irish gangs were built on shared suffering. Same streets, same slums, same enemies. But there was a flaw. They drank constantly. Meetings happened in bars. Decisions were made drunk. Grudges lasted longer than strategy. And while they were fighting each other inside Irish town, someone else was watching from the shadows. The Italians wait south of the docks. In the Italian neighborhoods of Brooklyn, a different kind of power was forming. The Italians were poorer, but more patient. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't fight publicly. They didn't drink on the job. They organized quietly. Families stuck together by hometown. Crews formed by loyalty, not ego. Violence was surgical, not emotional. And at the center of this rising force was a man who understood something the Irish did not. Crime wasn't just survival, it was business. His name was Frankie Yale. Frankie Yale. Enter the Shadow King. Frankie Yale didn't come to the docks swinging. He studied them. He watched how the Irish taxed cargo, how they intimidated workers, how they relied on fear instead of structure, and he believed he could do it better. Yale ran his operations like a company. No public drinking, no unnecessary violence, no loose talk. Extortion letters arrived sealed and silent. Payments were expected and collected. Those who resisted didn't get beaten in alleys. They vanished. And among Yale's young enforcers was a teenager already learning fast. A boy with a temper, a taste for power, and a name that would soon eclipse them all. Al Capone. The storm before the blood. By the late 1910s, the lines were drawn, even if no one said it out loud. The Irish held the docks. The Italians wanted them. The White Hand Gang believed their reputation was enough. Yale believed reputation was meaningless without control. Both sides knew what was coming. Neither intended to blink. And when the first body hit the pavement, there would be no turning back. At first, the violence came quietly. No headlines, no mass funerals, just men who didn't come home. An Italian dock worker beaten too badly to speak. An Irish stevedore found floating near Pier 9. A crate hijacking that ended with a gunshot echoing between warehouses. Each incident could be dismissed on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. Frankie Yale was testing the Irish grip, pushing just far enough to see how they'd respond. Sending men onto contested piers, extorting Italian laborers already working under Irish control, making it clear that the old order was being challenged. Denny Meehan understood exactly what was happening, and he responded the only way he knew how, with force. The message killings. The first killing that everyone noticed was meant to send a message. An Italian enforcer was found shot dead near the docks, his body left where anyone could see it. No attempt to hide it, no effort to deny responsibility. It was a statement. The docks were Irish, and anyone who forgot that would pay. But Frankie Yale didn't retreat. He escalated. Within weeks, Irish lieutenants began dying, not in barroom brawls, but in carefully planned ambushes. Stabbings in narrow alleys, gunshots fired at close range, clean and precise. This wasn't chaos, it was strategy. The Irish fought emotionally, the Italians fought deliberately, and caught between them were the men who worked the docks, forced to choose sides in a war they never asked for. Al Capone, learning to kill for Al Capone. This war was an education. He was still young, still reckless, still eager to prove himself. Under Frankie Yale, Capone learned that violence wasn't just about anger, it was about timing. Where to strike, who to hit, and when to stop. He worked doors, collected money, intimidated rivals, and when necessary, he pulled the trigger. Each encounter hardened him. Each success built confidence, and each mistake taught him restraint. Capone learned quickly that survival wasn't about being the toughest man in the room. It was about being the last one standing. Irish pride, Italian patience. The Irish responded the way they always had. Public shows of strength, beatings carried out in daylight, gunmen walking openly through Irish town. It reassured their own, but it also exposed them. The Italians took notes. They let the Irish believe they were winning, let them drink, let them boast. And then when they struck, it was devastating. An Irish lieutenant stabbed beyond recognition, another gunned down outside a saloon, witnesses everywhere, and silence from all of them. Fear began to shift. The docks were no longer unquestionably Irish. The rumours spread by now. Dock workers whispered about something darker moving through Brooklyn. They spoke of men killed so brutally that even seasoned police looked away, of knives used with terrifying precision, of bodies left as warnings rather than casualties. One name began to surface repeatedly: Two Knife Altieri, an enforcer who preferred blades to bullets, who killed up close, who left nothing to chance. His presence alone changed the tone of the war. This was no longer just about territory, it was about terror. Denny Meehan feels the pressure. As bodies piled up, Denny Meehan grew more paranoid. He drank more, trusted fewer people, and lashed out faster. He suspected betrayal everywhere, even among his own men. And in a gang built on loyalty, suspicion was poison. Men began to whisper, to choose sides quietly, to look toward Wild Bill and Pegleg instead. The White Hand Gang was still powerful, but it was no longer united, and Frankie Yale could see it. The docks turn into a graveyard. By the end of this phase of the war, the docks no longer felt like a workplace. They felt like a trap. Men checked shadows before speaking, looked twice before accepting jobs, and learned to keep their mouths shut. Always. Every crate unloaded carried risk. Every shift could be your last. And this was only the beginning, because the next phase of the war wouldn't just weaken the Irish, it would tear them apart from the inside. By 1918, Brooklyn wasn't just violent, it was nervous. People felt it in the air, in the way dock workers avoided eye contact, in how saloons emptied early, in how footsteps echoed a little louder at night. Something had changed. Men weren't just being killed anymore. They were being butchered. Bodies were discovered in alleys so narrow that sunlight barely touched the ground. Stomachs opened, throats carved, faces left unrecognizable. Even veteran ambulance drivers turned away from the scenes, and one name began to circulate in whispers, never spoken too loudly: Two Knife Altieri. He didn't rush, he didn't miss, and he didn't leave survivors. Altieri preferred silence over spectacle. No gunfire, no witnesses, just steel, applied with horrifying intimacy. His killings weren't meant to scare rivals alone. They were meant to infect the entire neighborhood with dread. The press struggled to describe what was happening. Some reporters began comparing the murders to Jack the Ripper. Others suggested a serial killer was stalking Brooklyn. The public didn't know what to believe, only that men were dying in ways that felt personal, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. The Italians had changed the rules. Fear spreads and the Irish strike back. The White Hand Gang could tolerate gunfights. They could tolerate ambushes. They could not tolerate humiliation. The knife killings hit them where pride lived. These weren't battles, they were executions. And worse, they made the Irish look weak. Wild Bill and Peg Leg decided to act. They received a tip that Altieri followed routines, that once a week he visited the same barber shop in Sheepshead Bay, far from Irish-controlled territory. It was risky, it was reckless, and it was fueled by rage. They didn't scout, they didn't verify, they didn't wait. They walked in with guns drawn and fired. The man in the chair died instantly. Only afterward did they realize the truth. They had killed the wrong man, an innocent Sicilian laborer. The mistake rippled outward immediately. Families screamed, neighbors gathered, the Italians were furious, and the war escalated beyond anything either side had planned, because the son of the murdered man would remember that day. And years later, in Chicago, that boy would become Machine Gun Jack McGurn, one of Al Capone's most feared killers. The Brooklyn docks had just created another monster. Capone gets marked. Violence breeds violence. Humiliation breeds obsession. For Al Capone, Brooklyn was no longer just a training ground. It became personal. An argument at Frankie Yale's saloon turned ugly when Capone disrespected the wrong woman. Her brother confronted him. Words were exchanged. Tempers flared. A knife flashed. Capone went down screaming. When he woke up in the hospital, his face was stitched together, carved permanently from ear to jaw. Scarface. The nickname followed him for life. The underworld called a truce over the incident. Capone apologized publicly, but privately, something hardened inside him. He had learned another lesson. Visibility is dangerous. Reputation invites enemies. And in Brooklyn, he had too many of both. Why Capone left by 1919? Capone had become a liability. The Irish knew his face. The police were circling, and Frankie Yale understood the reality. If Capone stayed, he would die. So Yale sent him west. Chicago wasn't an opportunity. It was an escape. Capone left Brooklyn not chasing power, but running from it. Running from Wild Bill. Running from revenge. Running from the war he had helped fuel. But he didn't leave empty-handed. He took with him everything Brooklyn had taught him. How to intimidate. How to organize violence. How to wait. And Chicago would pay the price. The war turns inward. With Capone gone, the war didn't cool. It fractured. Inside the White Hand Gang, Denny Meehan's paranoia intensified. He drank heavier, trusted no one, and began eliminating his own men, especially those loyal to Wild Bill. Each internal killing weakened the gang further. Men chose sides. Old loyalties dissolved. Fear replaced unity. The Italians didn't need to attack constantly anymore. They watched and waited. The boss falls. When Denny Meehan was finally killed, it wasn't in a public shootout or a dramatic ambush. It was quiet, domestic, brutal, shot in his own bedroom while his family slept. The message was unmistakable. The White Hand Gang was eating itself alive. Wild Bill took control almost immediately. He declared himself boss, promised order, and ruled with absolute fear. But order built on terror doesn't last. It only delays collapse. The beginning of the end. Under Wild Bill's reign, executions multiplied. Defectors were hunted down. Old grudges settled in blood. Revenge became routine. Meanwhile, the Italians modernized. They built systems, they invested profits, they prepared for prohibition. And while the Irish drank, the Italians planned. The docks were slipping away. and the final phase of the war was about to begin. In January of 1920, America flipped a switch. Alcohol was outlawed overnight. The 18th Amendment didn't dry the country out, it soaked it in money. Demand didn't disappear, it exploded. Speakeasies multiplied, prices soared, and suddenly anyone who could move liquor quietly stood to make a fortune. For the Italians, prohibition was a revelation. For the Irish, it was a test they weren't prepared for. The Italians adapt, the Irish don't. Frankie Yale immediately understood what prohibition meant. Liquor wasn't just another racket. It was infrastructure. It required supply chains, storage, distribution, bribery, discipline. And discipline was something the Italians had. They didn't drink on the job. They didn't fight each other publicly. They reinvested profits. Bootlegging gave them structure, real hierarchy, real logistics, real power. Meanwhile, the White Hand Gang treated liquor like a perk. They stole it, they drank it, they fought over it. Meetings turned into binges, strategy drowned in whiskey. The docks became less organized and more chaotic by the week, and Wild Bill knew it. A leader divided. Wild Bill wanted to modernize. He wanted to use the docks the way Yale was using them, as arteries for liquor, not just cargo. Pegleg agreed. They saw how much money the Italians were making, but Denny Meehan had refused to change, and even after his death, that mindset lingered. The White Hand Gang was built for intimidation, not enterprise, and while Wild Bill ruled with fear, fear alone couldn't compete with money. Blood for loyalty under Wild Bill's reign, executions became routine. Anyone suspected of loyalty to Denny Meehan was marked. Anyone who questioned leadership disappeared. Men were shot in bars, dragged into alleys, found dead under the bridge. It wasn't just violence, it was purging. The gang shrank, not because of outside pressure, but because of itself, and the Italians barely had to lift a finger. The Italians take the docks. As the Irish weakened, the Italians moved. Not with guns, with bribes. Union officials began listening. Hiring halls quietly shifted allegiance. Italian dock workers were hired where Irish ones once stood. The docks didn't change hands overnight. They eroded, pier by pier, contract by contract, payoff by payoff. And by the time the Irish noticed, half the waterfront was gone. Wild Bill falls. When Wild Bill finally left Brooklyn, persuaded by marriage, exhaustion, and the promise of peace, the damage was already done. The moment he stepped away, the Italians accelerated. By the time he returned drunk and reckless, he was no longer a boss. He was a liability. He was found dead inside the Dock Workers Club. Beaten, then shot, his body left as punctuation at the end of an era. The Irish had lost their last true enforcer. Pegleg's last stand. Pegleg Lonigan inherited a ruin, a fractured gang, lost territory, rising Italian power. He tried to fight it the only way he knew how, violence. But rage couldn't stop momentum. Italian enforcers like Albert Anastasia and Joe Adonis brought a new level of organization. Money replaced intimidation, influence replaced fear. And then came Christmas, the Adonis Club massacre, Christmas night, 1925. A crowded club, music, drinks, boasting. Pegleg was loud, drunk, defiant. The lights went out. Gunfire filled the room. When it was over, Pegleg was dead. His closest men were dead. And the White Hand Gang had lost its final leader. Al Capone had returned, not as a Brooklyn street thug, but as a Chicago boss. And he brought Chicago's philosophy with him. Swift, decisive, final. The end of the Irish era. After the massacre, the rest was formality. The White Hand Gang collapsed into irrelevance. Leaders were killed. Successors fought each other. No one could hold what was already gone. By the late 1920s, the docks belonged to the Italians. Albert Anastasia rose. Unions were controlled. Violence became quieter, more efficient. The Irish era was over. The docks today. Today, the Brooklyn waterfront is calm. Cafes, apartments, joggers along the piers. But beneath the concrete and polished wood lies history soaked into the ground, a battlefield where immigrants fought for survival, where crime became industry, where modern organized crime was born. The docks chose their winners, and they buried the rest. There is a moment in every criminal era when violence stops being expressive and becomes administrative. Brooklyn reached that moment in the late 1920s. The shootings didn't stop, and they just stopped making noise. The Italians didn't celebrate their victory over the Irish. They didn't mark territory with bodies. They didn't need to. Control no longer required spectacle. It required systems. The rise of invisibility. Albert Anastasia understood something the white hand never had. Fear works best when you don't know where it comes from. Under Anastasia, dock violence didn't vanish. It became precise. Men disappeared instead of being dumped. Union votes shifted instead of being beaten. Payoffs replaced threats. The waterfront didn't look controlled. It felt inevitable, and inevitability is stronger than fear. Why the Irish lost, really? It's easy to say the Irish lost because they drank too much. That's true, but it's incomplete. They lost because they never transitioned from survival gangs to business empires. Their power was built on personal loyalty, neighborhood identity, brute enforcement. The Italians built power on hierarchy, logistics, delayed gratification. One model burns fast, the other compounds. By the time Prohibition arrived, the Irish were already obsolete. They just didn't know it yet. The psychology of decline. What killed the White Hand? Gang wasn't outside pressure. It was internal erosion. Paranoia replaced trust. Alcohol replaced planning. Violence replaced strategy. Every leader killed his predecessor. Every successor ruled weaker than the last. Eventually, there was nothing left to inherit, just a name. And names don't control docks. The docks as a machine. By the early 1930s, the Brooklyn waterfront was no longer a battleground. It was a machine. Cargo moved, money flowed, unions complied, and violence existed only as a contingency, not a habit. That's when organized crime truly became organized. Not loud, not chaotic, not emotional, efficient. What history remembers and what it doesn't. History remembers Al Capone. It remembers headlines, massacres, nicknames. It does not remember dock foremen who switched sides quietly, union clerks who took envelopes without asking questions, men who never fired a gun but decided who worked and who didn't. Those men shaped the city more than any shooter ever did. The ghosts that remain walk the Brooklyn waterfront today, and you won't see memorials. You'll see joggers, coffee shops, converted warehouses. But history doesn't leave, it layers. Under every pier is a story of hunger. Under every building is a bargain struck in silence. Under every calm surface is a past soaked in pressure. The city doesn't erase violence, it absorbs it. The final truth. The Battle of the Brooklyn Docks wasn't about Irish versus Italian. It was about evolution, about who adapted and who didn't. The Irish fought like warriors, the Italians operated like managers, and history always sides with the system that lasts longer. Why this story still matters because the pattern never changed. Only. The names did. Every era creates men built for chaos, and every era replaces them with men built for control. If you understand the docks, you understand modern power. Final silence. No monuments were built for the White Hand Gang. No territory bears their name. They ruled briefly, they burned brightly, and then they were replaced. The docks didn't care who controlled them. They only cared that someone did. And when the noise ended, the machine kept running. Wars don't end when the last shot is fired. They end when the rules change. By the time the Brooklyn docks fell silent, no one was counting bodies anymore. They were counting shipments. This is the part of history that rarely makes headlines, because it doesn't look dramatic. There are no street battles, no funerals that draw crowds, no names shouted by newspaper boys. Instead, there are contracts, schedules, quiet agreements made in offices with the blinds half closed, and those agreements outlast bullets. The men who never needed nicknames. The White Hand Gang thrived on identity. They needed names, reputations, stories. The Italians who replaced them didn't. Power shifted away from personalities and toward positions. Dock boss, union delegate, shipping coordinator. Roles that could be filled by anyone as long as they followed the system. This is how violence retires without ever apologizing. Why chaos feels exciting and control feels boring. There's a reason people remember gang wars more vividly than consolidation. Chaos is loud. It gives you characters. It gives you villains and heroes. Control gives you paperwork. But paperwork shapes cities. The Irish fought like men who believed the world was watching. The Italians acted like men who knew it wasn't. And that difference changed everything. The cost of being early. The White Hand Gang didn't lose because they were weak. They lost because they were early. They mastered street violence before crime became corporate. They dominated docks before logistics mattered more than intimidation. They were specialists in a world that had moved on. History is ruthless to early adopters who don't evolve. When fear stops paying interest, fear is a short-term asset. It creates compliance, but not loyalty. Silence, but not stability. Eventually, fear demands escalation, more violence, more enforcement, more risk. The Italians understood something fundamental. The goal wasn't to terrify the docks. The goal was to make resistance feel pointless. The Union, as the real weapon guns win territory, unions keep it. Once control of the International Longshoremen's Association shifted, the war was already over, even if nobody announced it. Jobs became leverage, schedules became punishment, delays became discipline, no gunfire required. This is how crime became invisible. Why no one avenged the Irish? One of the strangest things about the fall of the White Hand Gang is how little retaliation followed. No resurgence, no revival, no second act. Because revenge requires structure, and by the end, the Irish had none left. They didn't lose a war, they dissolved. The city does not mourn. Cities don't remember who bled for them, they remember who organized them. Brooklyn didn't pause when the White Hand fell. It didn't stumble, it didn't fracture, it adjusted. And that adjustment is the most brutal verdict history can deliver. The men who walked away. Not every Irish dock worker died. Many adapted. They took jobs under Italian foremen, joined new unions, learned new rules. Survival doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks quiet. The myth of the last man standing popular history loves the idea of a final boss. One last gangster, one last showdown. Reality doesn't work that way. Power fades unevenly. Influence fragments. Control migrates. There was no last White Hand leader who mattered. That's the point. The shape of modern crime. By the time the 1930s settled in, organized crime had learned its most important lesson. Visibility is liability. The loudest men disappear first. The quietest men inherit everything. This wasn't just a Brooklyn lesson. It became a national one. Why this story still haunts America? Because America keeps repeating it. In business, in politics, in culture. Those who rise fast, burn fast. Those who build systems survive. The docks taught that lesson before anyone wrote it down. The final image. Imagine the Brooklyn waterfront at dawn. No gunshots, no shouting, just cranes moving slowly, men clocking in, cargo shifting from ship to city. Nothing looks violent, and yet every inch of it was paid for in blood. What really won the war? Not courage, not brutality, not loyalty, patience. The Italians didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they waited longer than the Irish could. The last word. The Battle of the Brooklyn Docks didn't end with a bang. It ended with silence. And silence, when enforced correctly, is the most powerful sound a city can make. History remembers leaders, It remembers bosses. It remembers killers with nicknames. But the Brooklyn docks were never held by names alone. They were held by thousands of anonymous men who woke up before dawn, stood in hiring lines, and waited to be chosen or ignored. Their loyalty wasn't ideological. It was economic. Whoever controlled work controlled survival, and that truth mattered more than flags, accents, or bloodlines. How control feels from the bottom to the men unloading ships, power didn't look like strategy. It looked like who got picked for a shift, who got sent home, who suddenly found his name crossed off the list. The Irish enforced this with fear. The Italians enforced it with routine. Routine lasts longer. The psychology of acceptance. At first, resentment simmered. Dock workers whispered. They compared notes. They waited for retaliation that never came. Then something subtle happened. Paydays arrived on time. Violence dropped, schedules stabilized, and resentment slowly turned into acceptance. Not because people approved, but because life became predictable. Predictability is persuasive. When survival overrides identity, ethnic loyalty is strong until hunger enters the room. Men who once refused to work under Italian foremen quietly accepted assignments, not proudly, not happily, but consistently. History often frames this as betrayal. In reality, it was adaptation. The end of street justice. The Irish world ran on personal grievance. An insult demanded a response. A slight demanded blood. The Italian system discouraged that, not through morality, but through efficiency. Personal violence disrupted business, and business had become the priority. Why the police stopped caring? It wasn't because crime disappeared. It was because disorder did. Police departments respond to pressure, not principle. As shootings declined and headlines quieted, so did enforcement. The system rewarded stability, even criminal stability. The new language of power stopped speaking in threats. It spoke in permits, licenses, contracts, union votes. Violence still existed, but it became private, hidden, rare. That made it more terrifying, not less. The men who failed to adapt, some Irish figures tried to return. They made noise. They threatened. They tried to reclaim relevance. They were removed quickly, without ceremony. The system no longer tolerated nostalgia. Why no new white hand rose? Because the conditions that created them were gone. No vacuum existed. Control had already been absorbed into structure. You can't resurrect a street gang in a world run by logistics. The lie of romantic crime. Popular culture loves the early era. The fists, the shootouts, the saloons. But criminals themselves rarely romanticize it. They remember instability. They remember exhaustion. They remember how close everything came to collapse. How organized crime learned to disappear. The greatest lesson of the Brooklyn docks wasn't how to fight. It was how to blend. The future belonged to men whose names never appeared in print. The city is the final winner. New York didn't care who won. It cared that goods moved, that labor showed up, that money flowed. The docks didn't belong to gangs. They belonged to the city. And the city always reclaims control, eventually. A quiet transition. There was no announcement, no formal surrender, just a gradual replacement of faces. A foreman one year, a different one the next. By the time anyone noticed, it was over. Why this story feels unfinished? Because it doesn't end. It evolves. Every port city repeats this cycle. Every industry follows the same arc. Chaos, control, consolidation. The real lesson. Violence opens doors. Systems decide who gets to stay inside. The White Hand broke doors. The Italians built hallways. The final stillness. By the early 1930s, the bon docks looked ordinary. That was the victory. No drama, no legends, just work. And that's how power prefers it. By the time the last white hand figures disappeared from the docks, no one announced victory. There was no parade, no declaration, no acknowledgement. History didn't mark the moment, because history rarely does when power changes hands quietly. The Brooklyn waterfront didn't collapse, it didn't erupt, it didn't even noticeably change, it simply continued. And that continuity was the clearest sign of who had truly won. The men who never knew they lost many dock workers never realized the war had ended. They still showed up at the same hour, still stood in the same lines, still carried the same crates, only the tone had shifted. Fewer beatings, fewer random disappearances, more rules, unwritten but enforced. For the men at the bottom, this wasn't freedom, but it was survivable. And survivable is often enough. How power hides in normalcy. The most successful systems don't feel oppressive, they feel routine. Once violence retreats into the background, people stop questioning who's in charge. That's how control lasts. The Italian organizations understood this instinctively. They didn't need the docks to fear them, they needed the docks to function. The disappearance of heroes and villains. In the Irish era, personalities mattered. Everything revolved around men like Denny, Meehan, Wild Bill, Lovett, Pegleg, Lonigan. Their moods shaped outcomes. Their tempers dictated bloodshed. That system collapsed under its own weight. The Italian era removed personality from the equation. Individuals became replaceable, and replaceability is stability. Why the new bosses stayed invisible. Fame is liability. The men who inherited the docks understood that better than anyone. They avoided interviews, avoided nicknames, avoided public bravado. They let unions speak, they let foremen speak, they let accountants speak, and while the city slept, power moved through paperwork instead of pistols. When crime becomes administration. This was the real transformation. Crime stopped being reactive. It became managerial. Decisions were made weeks in advance, not seconds. Violence wasn't emotional anymore. It was corrective, used sparingly, precisely, and always with plausible deniability. The myth of the end. People like to believe stories conclude cleanly. They don't. The White Hand Gang didn't lose, they became obsolete, and obsolescence is quieter than defeat. The lesson the city learned. New York didn't defeat organized crime. It absorbed it. It shaped it. It pressured it into becoming predictable enough to coexist with. That's the uncomfortable truth. Cities don't eliminate power structures, they negotiate with them. Why this story still matters, because the docks were a prototype. What happened here repeated later in Chicago, New Orleans, Los Angeles, Las Vegas. Street violence gives way to structure. Structure gives way to corporate crime, and corporate crime gives way to influence. The Brooklyn docks were simply early. The cost of efficiency stability came at a price. Crime became harder to see, harder to trace, harder to prosecute. By the time authorities realized what had happened, the system was too embedded to dismantle. What the White Hand never understood, they believed fear was permanent. It isn't. Fear burns fast. Systems endure. The men who watched it all, old dock workers, would later talk about it quietly, not as history, as memory. They didn't debate who was right. They talked about when things felt wild and when they stopped, and most agreed on one thing. Life got quieter. The final shift. By the mid-1930s, the docks no longer felt dangerous. That illusion was the final victory, because danger hadn't disappeared. It had simply learned to hide better. Why no one tried again? Because every new group studied what happened. They learned the lesson the hard way. You don't fight a system by being louder. You outlast it by becoming invisible. The shadow that remains, even today. If you walk those streets at night, nothing feels remarkable. That's the point. Power leaves no fingerprints when it succeeds. A story without a monument. No statues stand for the White Hand. No plaques explain their fall. The city moved on, as it always does. That is New York's true genius. The end that isn't an end. This story doesn't close with a body. It closes with silence, and silence is always the final stage of control. After the docks went quiet, New York didn't celebrate. It exhaled, not in relief, but in adjustment. Cities don't pause to mourn the men who once ruled their shadows. They simply recalibrate. Power changes hands, routines shift, and life continues as if nothing dramatic ever happened. That is how cities survive centuries of violence. They normalize it, and then they move on. The difference between peace and control, what followed the gang wars, was not peace. It was predictability. Violence still existed, but it arrived without warning and disappeared without explanation. The randomness that once terrified dock workers was replaced by a colder certainty. Do your job. Follow the rules. Don't ask questions. That was enough. Why the noise had to end. The Irish era was loud because it had to be. They were fighting for space, for recognition, for survival. The Italian era was quiet because it didn't need to prove anything. And that difference matters. Noise attracts attention. Attention attracts pressure. Pressure breaks systems. Silence does the opposite. The men who learned too late. Some former white hand figures lived long enough to see what replaced them. They watched younger men operate differently, dress differently, speak less. They understood, finally, what they had missed. The game had changed while they were still playing the old one. History is unforgiving that way. The shadow economy settles in. By the late 1930s, the docks were no longer a battleground. They were an engine. Cargo moved on time. Unions functioned smoothly. Money flowed upward and outward. Crime no longer interrupted daily life. It blended into it. That was the real victory, because it isn't about good and evil. It's about adaptation. The men who survived weren't the bravest, they weren't the most violent, they weren't even the smartest, they were the most patient. And patience is rarely celebrated. There is no final scene where everything stops, no closing credits for an era. The White Hand Gang didn't collapse in a single night. It thinned, it faded, it was replaced. That's how most power structures die, not dramatically, but gradually. If this story has a protagonist, it isn't a gangster. It's New York, a city that absorbs chaos, repurposes it, and carries on. People come and go. Empires rise and fall. The city remains, always watching, always adjusting. Even when the gunfire stops, something remains. A culture of silence, a respect for invisible boundaries, an understanding that power doesn't announce itself. These things outlive generations. Not because we admire the violence, but because we're trying to understand it, trying to understand how ordinary men become instruments of larger systems, how environments shape behavior, how ambition collides with reality, and how rarely anyone wins. If the docks taught America anything, it was this. Violence opens doors, but systems decide who stays inside. The White Hand kicked doors down. The Italians built corridors, and corridors last longer. Picture the docks at night. Water moving gently against the pier, lights reflecting on the surface. No voices, no footsteps, just the quiet hum of a city that has already learned its lesson. The Battle of the Brooklyn Docks didn't end with justice. It ended with efficiency, and efficiency is rarely noticed until it controls everything. Fade out. History doesn't end. It settles, and then it waits for the next generation to repeat the cycle, believing once again that this time will be different.